Hey everyone, good morning. If you're new to my page, since the results of the 2024 election came in, I have been talking with all of you in TikTok land about the Spanish Civil War and what it can teach us about our current moment. It's been a fantastic conversation. I'm so excited that you guys want to have it. And there are a couple of comment threads that have been going on my video about the Spanish Civil War and also on my videos about the Soviet Union and Stalin, and I wanted to address some of the points that have come up. And I haven't addressed these comments specifically in the comment thread because you all have taken care of it. You all have made my points for me, so thank you for that. But I did want to kind of talk about it more in depth because I think they're important things to think about. So the first comment that I wanted to talk about was this idea that by me saying that Stalin was not a good guy, that it was bad that he jailed all these people, that the collectivization efforts that his government put in place in the early 1930s caused an enormous famine that cost a lot of lives. The fact that I was saying that these things were bad and that these things were bad for socialism. There was a comment on the thread that said that I'm spouting CIA propaganda by saying these things about Stalin. First point I want to make about this is that the people in the United States, the socialists in the United States who had been active in the socialist movement, who had spent years of their life agitating in favor of socialist reforms in the United States, who perhaps had gone to war in Spain, perhaps had gone to war during World War II, they were hearing this news coming out of Russia about the horrors that happened under the Stalinist regime and were disillusioned with socialism. I want to say that these people are not dumb. They were not inclined to just take at face value anything that's coming out of the US government. These are not people who are just going along to get along. These are agitators, these are liberals, these are people on the far left. So if they hear something, they're going to decide whether or not they feel it's reliable. And these folks felt it was reliable. Now, why was that? Because it's not just coming from the CIA. If it was just coming from the US government, it's completely fair to be skeptical. I think we need to be really real and honest about the ways that the United States government has lied to the people of the United States. They did it a lot. They did it systematically, and they did it a lot in the 70s and 80s especially. But before that as well. So the US government does lie. So if this was information that was just coming from the US government, it would be fair to be skeptical, but it's not. There were people who came out of the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who were able to tell these stories firsthand. There were dissidents, there were activists, there were artists, there were political actors who were working against the communist government who came out of Russia and were able to tell these stories firsthand of what happened during collectivization, of the repression that happened under the Soviet state. Now, even more people were able to come under perestroika in the 80s when this Gorbachev liberalized the Soviet state so that they allowed more people to leave the country, not as many as wanted to, I'm sure, but more people were able to leave the country under Gorbachev. And those people came out of the Soviet Union and told their stories. Just to tell an anecdotal story from my own life, I worked with a woman in my college years. I worked in the costume shop at my college at Northwestern in Chicago. Shout out to Stella. I worked with a woman who had immigrated from the Ukraine and she had grown up in the Soviet Union. She was Jewish. She told me about how, this is a funny story, she told me about how Jews were oppressed under the Soviet Union. And me, the young little socialist that I was like, but I thought that socialists weren't supposed to care about your religious background. And she rolled her eyes at me. At my innocent little socialist heart. She was like, no, they oppressed the Jews. And I was like, okay, good to know. And she had been educated and had gone to school to be a civil engineer in the Ukraine, which what was then the Soviet Union, and she wasn't able to find work as a civil engineer, and so she found work as a seamstress and a clothing maker, and that was the job that she had when she came to the United States. And she was the one who taught me the best tip I've ever gotten, which is if you don't like tailor's chalk, if you're a seamstress, this is a tangent, but if you're a seamstress, you don't like tailor's chalk, use the those little nubs of soap that you don't know what to do with, and they're too hard to handle, and they kind of slip around in the bath, and you don't like to use them. Those little nubs of soap, you dry them out for a couple days, use them to mark up fabric. They're actually the best fabric marker I've ever come across. So thank you, Stella. So what we got at the end of the Soviet Union was a million first-person stories about what was going on in the Soviet Union. So it wasn't just the CIA propaganda saying that Stalin was bad. It was also the people who lived in the Soviet Union that said that Stalin was bad. And that doesn't mean that you need to believe every first-person account that you hear, but when you get a huge amount of first-person accounts, you can find them to be pretty reliable. The other piece of this is that not only did this happen in Russia, this happened in other communist states as well. So collectivization in China, similar results. People starved. People were forced out of the cities onto the farms because they needed farm workers, and those people starved. Like it was brutal. So the same thing happened in the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. That was a repressive communist state. That felt a bit more deliberately sadistic, that whole situation. I think that Pol Pot was, talk about dark triad, like he was really extreme, but that was theoretically under the guise of collectivization, and it was brutal, and millions of people died. Also, North Korea, famine there, Cuba, famine there. And part of that, though, and it's important that we have nuance in this conversation, part of that was not just that these collectivization and farming practices were misguided, were too extreme, were badly implemented, there were too many forces against them. All of those things were true. But the other piece of it is that communist countries in this time period were isolated from other countries. The way that we in the modern world prevent famine is with import. That's how we do it. Why do we not have famine in the United States? A lot of that is the fact that we're a very wealthy and fertile country. Our farming practices, for better or for worse, are very productive. There's some environmental factors there that I won't get into, but in general, they're very productive. So all of that is great, but we would still have famine sometimes if it weren't for being able to import food from other countries. So how do you deal with if a crop fails in the United States? You import it from another country where the crop has not failed. And our food and farming world is diversified enough and large enough, and we can import things easily enough that for the most part in wealthy countries you don't have famines. And this was true in the 20th century as well, except that if you're in a communist country, you can only import from other communist countries. So in Cuba, when they were struggling economically, because they were so isolated, because it's a very small island and it is hard for it to be sustainable, not that it can't be, but they struggled with being sustainable in this tiny country, they were able to do okay because they were importing things from Russia until the Soviet Union failed, and then Cuba really struggled because they were isolated and they weren't able to import. This was true of China and their relationship with Russia, which was not always good. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. So they struggled. North Korea, again, when they had the support of other communist countries, they were able to do okay. In the 90s, when those other communist countries fell, they were isolated and there were massive famines because they weren't able to import. They didn't have any backup plan. So isolating is bad. It's bad for countries. And a lot of times the Western world likes to impose these isolating trade practices on countries that they don't like. But what tends to happen is it hurts the people of the country and not the government of the country. That's just the reality. So great conversation, a lot of nuance there, and I'll be posting some more.